My name is Josh Campbell, and I am the OSU Extension Educator for Oklahoma County. So I cover all of the Oklahoma County, most of Oklahoma City and Edmond metro areas, and I educate people about urban agriculture and natural resource issues, everything from water to composting, which we'll be talking about today. And so I'm going to jump right into our presentation here in just a little bit. As we get started, we'll talk a little bit about why we're holding these workshops. So I represent Think Water, which is Oklahoma State University's water conservation education program. And we have partnered with the city of Edmond to educate Edmond residents about the importance of water issues, the importance of water conservation. And basically it all boils down to we're trying to teach people about the responsible use of water. So we're helping them implement sustainable practices, implement landscape practices that are going to use less water, be more efficient, less input-driven landscapes. And we all know that even though, and I'll show you here in a minute some pictures, but we all know that we can experience pretty extreme variabilities in weather here in Oklahoma. This spring was one of our wettest on record. Yet we get to the summer and we were begging for rain just because it dried up so quickly. And so Oklahoma's water resources are limited. Every water resource is limited. And so as we look to the future, as our cities grow, the city of Edmond is growing dramatically. And as I'll tell you here in a few minutes, they're expanding the infrastructure to be able to treat water and provide it to citizens. And so as our cities grow, as the demand on our water resources grow, the importance of thinking about sustainable practices like composting continues to grow. And it has benefits not just to the environment, but also to our economy and to people as a whole. How many of you remember April and May looking like this, right? It's funny how quickly sometimes we can, just a few months out from things like this, and we forget. How many of you remember 2013, back when Lake Hefner looked like this? So a lot of people have forgotten about this as well, but we go through these wet and dry patterns, and when we're in a period of drought, we can be very, very, very dry. And when we're in a period of wet, we can experience immense amount of rainfall. So this is just to show you the contrast between 2013 and 2015, what Lake Hefner looked like, and largely the result of just the drought that we were in. This is a map showing the precipitation history of Oklahoma as a whole, so the statewide precipitation history. That line, the dark line you see down the center there on this chart is basically the average. If you take all the individual data points, that gives you the statewide average. And our statewide long-term average rainfall is right around 34 inches, just a little short of 34 inches of precipitation for the year as our statewide average. And then each of these little black dots are individual year data points, okay? And so when you put all that together, you get the dips below the line, those brown portions, which are periods of below average rainfall, or drought periods, and then you have periods of above average rainfall. And for most of us in this room, our lives, what we've built our habits around is this period, I would say this stretch right in here from the late 70s until today, and we've predominantly been in historic wet patterns during that time. Even though we have experienced a few drought periods, we've experienced overall a period of historic wet. And so, we've added irrigation systems to our homes. We've put in landscapes that need lots of water, and so we've built kind of our status quo, our normal around what, if we actually look back through history, is not necessarily a normal. And so it's important to realize that as we think about the future and how we plan for water resource issues. Water consumption here in the city of Edmond. In the winter months, it is down as low as 8 million gallons a day, but in the summer months, it peaks up to about 26 million gallons a day. And so we can see that contrast. It tells us that that difference is largely going outside, whether it be on landscapes, to maintain yards, or in pools or car washes or whatever. It's largely going outdoors, that difference there. The City of Edmond's population over the past 20 years has increased about 35%, from 68,000 to 92,000. And so you think about that population difference, that's more people needing water resources, more people using water, and the supply, although the city has done a lot of things to engineer and sustain a supply and be able to provide water to Edmond residents, the supply is a finite resource. The population continues to grow, and so how do we address those issues? Right now, the City of Edmond is putting in $400 million worth of upgrades to expand their water and wastewater infrastructure so that they can continue to meet the day-to-day demands of water needs. When you go to your house or to your school or wherever and you turn on the faucet, how often do you think about how that gets to you and the cost and the effort that it takes to get that to you? There's real cost associated with delivering clean, healthy, fresh water to you. So all that being said, you may be wondering, like, I'm here to learn about composting, and how does composting have anything to do with water conservation? Well, I'm hoping that by the end of that, you would be able to tell somebody that you meet on the street why composting and water conservation can go hand in hand. To give you a little bit of background, composting is what I consider this magical substance that can fix sandy soils that are devoid of nutrients and they don't hold water, so it can give them properties that hold water and provide nutrients. And then soils that are really dense, like most of us experience here in central Oklahoma, heavy clay soils that are hard to get a shovel into, it can break those up and help let water flow through them more easily. So you'll learn about lots of the benefits of composting by the end of the day, but I'm here to tell you that composting and water do go hand in hand. So show of hands, how many of you have ever used compost in some form or fashion in your life? Most everybody in the room, okay? How many of you have ever participated in composting, whether you've done it at your home or you've done it at some school or community scale? Okay, so there's a general familiarity with what composting is and how it works. Anybody had any epic fails in composting? I have, right? So I think for a lot of people, they jump into composting, maybe they don't really know what it is, or they've been around it, they've seen somebody else trying to do it, and they've seen it be stinky or be something that scares them. And so there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of fears even associated with composting at home. And so hopefully we'll also be able to dispel some of those fears by the end of the day. In a nutshell, what I consider composting essentially just harnessing natural things that are already happening. So you're harnessing nature's way of disposing of solid waste. So if you've ever been on a walk in the woods and you've lifted up a stump, a piece of wood that's fallen, you lift it up. Usually there's some moisture there. You lift it up and bugs scramble everywhere. The bottom side of that log has started to decay and break down and rot. Composting is harnessing natural ways that nature breaks down and decays organic material, okay? So it's nature's way of breaking up organic material into humus and minerals, and then returning those materials, those nutrients, back to the soil. It's building soil. How many of you have seen a landfill? Show of hands. Oklahoma County's highest point of elevation is actually a trash mountain. It's a landfill. So you can be proud of that. If you live in Oklahoma City, our mountain is in Oklahoma County as a whole, our mountain is a landfill. And that's because this is nationwide data from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, but nationwide, about half of all municipal garbage that goes to the landfills is actually compostable material. It's stuff that could be diverted and composted. So 21% of all the material that we send to trash is food scraps. 15% of all the material we send to trash is paper. That'd be like maybe paper towels or cardboard, newspapers, things like that. And then 8% would be yard trimmings. And that would be things like the grass clippings that we bag from our mower, or the leaves that we rake up and bag and we send off to the trash. Those are great sources of organic material that could build healthy soils, but we're sending them to the trash. And then finally, 8% is wood material. So whether that be tree material or wood pallets, that kind of stuff. So why compost? I consider it an excellent way to reduce yard waste. It produces a soil amendment. And here in Oklahoma, I'm told that about 25% of all of Oklahoma's landfill space is just yard waste. So you think about a quarter of all the stuff we're throwing away here in Oklahoma is grass clippings, leaf trimmings, trees from ice storm debris, things like that. That kind of raw landscape material that could be diverted and turned to compost. So why compost? It helps the garden, it helps the environment, and it diverts lawn and garden waste. Why use compost? Compost is an excellent way, like I said earlier, to improve soil health, soil fertility, but it's not all that it is, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. But a big misconception is that compost is just a fertilizer, and it's more than a fertilizer. It's a way to amend the soil. It provides, yes, nutrients, usually in much lower quantities than like a synthetic fertilizer would, but it provides living organisms. Every 1 tablespoon, I'm told, of soil has about 1 billion microorganisms in it. And so you think about, and compost, I'm sure, has a higher concentration. And so you think about all the living activity that's going on there, and those are engineers improving your soil. They're breaking down the things that are in your soil and spitting them out in the form of nutrients that are available for plants. And so that's the power of compost, is it harnesses that living material. It acts as as kind of a fluffing agent for hard, heavy soils. You know, if you get a rainfall and you've seen after just a few minutes that your landscape, your yard ponds, the addition of compost can dramatically improve that infiltration, prevent ponding and things like that. And then on a sandy soil, if you've ever been to the beach and you're standing there, you see how water washes onto the sand of the beach and then recedes very, very quickly. Sandy soils, when you look at those soil particles, are so large and coarse compared to clay soil particles that water and nutrients, they don't stay. They leach and move through that soil very quickly. And so compost actually binds that together and allows all those good things to stay in soils that are really coarse. So just to recap again, it's a free fertilizer and mulch, but it's not just a fertilizer. It builds soil structure, so whether you're using it to improve drainage or you're using it to improve water holding capacity, it does both of those things. And when I first started learning about compost in soils and how that works, it just kind of blows your mind. The same substance can slow water down, and it can, in sandy soils, and it can speed water up in terms of allowing it to move more freely through a soil in a clay soil. And how does it do that? It's just awesome. It diverts organic waste. So, you think about compost, it is made up of substances that were once living materials. So whether that be animal manure, some composts are made from animal manure, some composts are made from plant material, and some are made from a combination of all sorts of things, food scraps and woody materials. And so all of those organic things break down and become different types of compost. Compost makes the nutrients more readily available to the plant. Nutrients have to go through a breakdown cycle in order to be available in a form that plants can actually utilize. And so compost has already gone through that process. The nutrients that are there are immediately available to benefit plants. And it feeds and supports the living things in the soil. You know this, worms are good, but when you lift up a healthy soil, those living organisms in the soil are a sign that you're on the right track, that things are going well. Living organisms in the soil are going to continue to work the soil. So worms, as they move through the soil, they're making air channels and air pockets which allow for air and water movement through the soil more readily. So they're your workers. When you encourage the living organisms in the soil, you're having them do the work of improving the soil for you as well. So some of the same things that compost does, having things like worms in your soil do the same things. They enhance drainage, improve air exchange. They are feeding on organic materials that are in the soil and then spitting that out in the form of just awesome nutrient-rich worm poo and things. So soil organic matter, the word organic matter, I'm not talking about organic in the sense of like organic vegetables or organic produce, things that you would go buy that have the organic USDA organic label. I'm using a little o in the sense that it's not referring to the way something was grown or the way something was handled, but in the sense that it was derived from something that was once alive, whether that be plant material or animal material. Organic matter is in the soil, and so if you ever do a soil test or you're wanting to improve your soil, you'll hear people talk about improving organic matter content. And most Oklahoma soils are pretty devoid of organic matter. We're lucky to get 1 or 2% organic matter naturally in our soils, and healthy soils are going to be, ideal soils I would say are going to be more around the 5% organic matter content. And so when you think about organic matter, you're thinking about bits and pieces of broken down plant material, dead roots, leaf litter, all of those things. And so, when you think about building healthy soils, you always hear people refer to the forest floor. And that's what I want you to imagine when you think about organic material. It's that layer, leaves drop, seeds drop, animals are pooing. There's that constant layering and building and breakdown of organic material that's building this rich, beautiful soil. And the word humus, soil humus, is that fully decomposed, stable, broken down organic matter. So if you've ever mulched a garden bed and then a year or two later you come back and you lightly pull it back and you see this beautiful black layer that's right on top of your normal soils, that's what humus is, that rich material that's there. Some of the factors that affect the organic matter content of your soils. So again, I said you want to increase the organic matter content to increase the fertility of your lawn and garden soils. Tillage. Every time you till in a conventional tillage system, you open up the soil to oxygen, and so you deplete organic material. So the more vegetative cover you have, the greater organic matter content you have as a rule. Compost, again, is going to increase organic matter content in the soil. It's feeding and supporting the living things that you have in your soil. It is an excellent and inexpensive way to increase your soil workability. And we've talked about all these things before, but really, if you imagine the beautiful loamy soil that's just over years and years has had organic matter and compost and things incorporated into it, it's like chocolate cake. It gets you really excited to garden in. It improves drainage and water holding capacity. So when we have those intense rains in this, like we had in the spring, really organic matter rich soils would have allowed that water to flow through more freely. We would have had less flooding, less ponding issues. And then it also holds on to that water longer. So you think about moving out into the summer when the rain shut off and we started to dry out, it would have held on to more of that water that we had in the spring in the soil profile versus letting it evaporate out and dry. From March to October, this is an EPA statistic that I found, and I found this pretty interesting. From March to October of every year, the volume of yard waste that comes out of residential houses increases from 20 to 50%. So you think about the summer, we're growing vegetable gardens, we've got landscape plants, and so we've got all this kind of bloom of things growing in our yards, things growing, and then all of that in October, usually you start to have plants that die back. Your annuals are dying back, your perennials are going dormant, so you have cuttings and things. And so we have this huge volume of yard debris come October. I like to share this slide. It's something that I think is a good joke. Our soil lab director, Dr. Hailan Zong, always says that dirt is a 4-letter word, and I always give him a hard time and I say, so is soil, right? Soil's a 4-letter word as well. But soil's a good 4-letter word that your mom will let you say, and dirt is a bad 4-letter word. And the reason for that is that dirt is what you would describe as soil that is worthless, devoid of use. It's the stuff that you bring in on your shoes. It's it's just dusty dirt. Whereas soil is alive. It's what you can use to grow your vegetables. It's what you can use to garden in. It's productive, we'd say. And so compost is what turns your dirt into soil. It's what can aid you in taking a soil that is not productive and is not yielding you the results you want, and can help bring you to a point of productivity. So again, back to the beginning, composting is about harnessing a natural process, right? So there are different ways of composting, different speeds at which you can compost, but when you boil it down in a nutshell, all you're doing is letting nature do something that it already does, but depending on how well you harness those natural processes, the success and the speed at which you get finished compost is going to differ. And again, these guys are your workforce. So as you think about composting, we don't want to see, we get creeped out by bugs and critters and things, but more often than not, seeing these things in our compost pile is going to be good, because those are our workforce doing the work of breaking down our compost. And that's how nature takes organic material and turns it into soil. It's using this workforce here. So when we think about composting, there are two main ways you can compost. There's hot composting and cold composting. And I think that most of us when we first start trying to compost, whether we know that there's a difference between cold and hot composting or not, we have this vision of hot composting in our mind. We think it's going to rapidly break down and decay and turn into this beautiful chocolate cake soil that I can use over the course of just a few months. And so when we don't have those results, we get discouraged, we give up, we stop composting, we think we're doing it wrong. And I'm here to tell you that you can do hot composting, and you can batch turn material from your landscape into finished compost within a matter of a month or two. If you really, really harness and follow a recipe and a plan, you can do those things. But for most homeowners who are first getting into composting, we're going to start with cold composting. We're going to probably have a pallet bin in our backyard, or a little, maybe a compost tumbler that we throw some material in, and it's going to sit, and it's going to get some rainfall when we get rain. It's going to get airflow when the wind blows, but other than that, we're just piling material on it. And so what happens is we are composting, but what happens is over time we're just composting, below, and you'll find that the older material below is your finished compost, but the stuff on top, as we continue to add and add and add, we're delaying the composting process. And so to cold compost, at home, cold composting, you may take a year or even 2 years to fully break down a whole bin of compost and have something that's usable. And even still, when we compost, even after years and years, we're going to have material that is still big in chunks. And that's why we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about particle size, and how the smaller the things you put in your compost pile, the more rapidly they'll break down. And so to get that beautiful finished compost that you buy out of the bag or that you see people use, they've actually sifted that so that the most finished stuff falls through. Cold composting, again, is going to take a long time. It's going to be probably what 90% of home composters start with. If you try to hot compost, you can do it on a home scale, but you have to have a compost pile or bin that's at least 3 feet by 3 feet in volume, in order to, 3 feet tall, 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep. If you don't have that, you most likely cannot get the hot temperatures necessary to break down the compost. So that size is what's necessary to break it down. Also, you have to hot compost, you really have to pay attention to the ratio of dry and brown material that you put in versus the more moist green material, or the carbon versus the nitrogen, right? So you need both of those things, but you need to have them in about a 3 to 1 parts. For every 3 handfuls, let's say, of dried leaves, we might have 1 handful of coffee grounds or food scraps. And so that keeping those ratios in balance is going to allow us to speed up how quickly the compost breaks down. Oxygen and airflow are other key factors. So if we're not turning a compost pile every few weeks, if we don't have space on the sidewalls of the pile for air to flow through it, then it's going to take a lot longer for it to break down. So airflow, oxygen, the right moisture, and the right mixture of brown and green materials is what's necessary to do rapid composting. And you'll see as a homeowner dozens and dozens and dozens of different composting options and methods out there. You'll see people selling different types of composting bins and composting tumblers and composting buckets and vermicomposting, and it can be kind of overwhelming. What I'd like you to realize is that there's a composting method to fit just about every lifestyle, whether you live in an apartment or you live on a large acreage, whether you have access to a tractor to turn a pile or you're just statically doing it in a small container. There are options to fit just about every lifestyle. And so I just threw up a few of the different ones that you'll hear about. Large-scale composting, trench composting, lasagna composting. You can get overwhelmed pretty quickly, but you'll see things like lasagna composting is just layering cardboard on the ground, layering grass clippings, leaves, whatever, and you're just basically building, a lasagna layer on the ground. Tumbler compost, these are ones we often see in stores. They would be like you see here in the center of this, be something that we fill material with and we spin with a crank. A lot of people, I think the most often thing that comes to mind when thinking about compost bins outside, people think about these 3-bin wooden pallet composting setups, and those are good. They have their uses, but I think that's where most people's minds go when they think about composting outside. Also, these wire mesh bins, they're very common for people who are layering maybe leaf material and trying to compost yard leaves. So there are all sorts of different composting methods and composting styles, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. I'd like you to go to this website. This is a website I found. It's actually from Canada, but they have a really cool quiz. So you take this quiz on this website, and it'll ask you a series of questions about yourself, what types of, what your circumstances are, where you live, how much extra time you have, all of those things. And it'll give you some options on what composting methods might be a good fit for you and give you a reason why. So I'll give you some time to write that down. And it should be on the next slide as well. Yeah, it's right there on the next slide. So this is what the quiz looks like. You go to this website and it'll say start your quiz. What I love about it is you don't actually have to give them your email address to take the quiz. You can take the quiz and not give them any information, which is rare these days. You don't usually find places that will let you benefit without giving them your email address. So you start the quiz. It'll ask you a series of questions. So I did this one myself. I started here. It says, do you want hands-on or hands-off composting? How much space do you have available for composting? Do you want to compost your grass clippings from your yard? So I just started answering the questions that it presented to me, and based on how I responded, it would generate another subset of questions. And I got to this point and it said, you should check out your first option should be a medium-sized compost bin in your backyard, and then your second option would be a larger pallet compost bin. So that's what it recommended for me. But when I've had other people do this, it recommends all sorts of different options. And so it's a fun way if you're flirting with maybe getting into composting at home or composting in your backyard to get a feel for what options might be good for you. This is a chart that I also took from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, the place that showed the garbage bag and how much material is going into the landfills, and they did a pros and cons and advantages and disadvantages of different types of composting. And so we won't go through all of these, but you can see it's easy to kind of get information of what some of the pros, what some of the cons are of each of those. And also on this website, I'll go back to it. When you go to this website, they actually have profiles of people that decided they were given an assignment and they decided that they were going to compost for a year with a different method. They put the cost that it took for them to get started with that method of composting, how much effort it took weekly, monthly, yearly, and what their results were, and they track it all. It's really cool. You see, person, their name, what they live in a single family house, and this is their situation, and it shows you, and they talk about the hurdles and the frustrations, what they liked, what they didn't like about that composting method. And so if you're really thinking about composting, but you're one of those types of people that likes to do a little bit of research beforehand and figure out what might be the best option, I would encourage going through this. Some of the pros and cons. If you're hot composting, like we said earlier, you're going to have a quick finished product. You're going to yield compost much quicker. Some of the disadvantages is that it's going to take a lot of labor and attention and time to devote to turning it and to making sure that you've watered the compost pile. A lot of us, we think, okay, I've got to give the dogs and cats their water. I've got to water the potted plants. How many of you think about watering your compost pile, right? So if you hot compost, you have to think about that. Cold composting, it's going to be less labor. It's going to be overall, simpler, but it's going to take a lot longer. You're going to yield compost in a year to 2 years versus a few months. You think about bin composting, it says here it has a neat and tidy appearance. You can use it for both hot and cold composting, but you've got to build a bin. You've got to put in the labor of constructing that. So there are pros and cons. That's what I want you to realize with each type of composting method, and you have to determine what's going to be the best fit for you. In addition to being a lot of different types of composting methods, there's really 3 scales at which I see composting happening. There's the home or backyard scale, there's the community scale, which might be like a community garden or a community club or organization, and then there's the industrial scale. And we have all 3 of these here in the central Oklahoma metropolitan area. For most of us, we're going to be interested in backyard composting, but if you are interested in composting and you simply just don't have the patience or the ability to do that yourself, there are options available in terms of diverting that waste, taking it to a collection site, using a service like Fertile Ground Cooperative who collects the compost for you. So there are beginning to be more and more options for people to partake in composting, even if you're not actually doing it yourself. Community composting, that would be on a larger scale than home composting. So that would be predominantly, large wooden pallet areas. Maybe it's a collection from a community garden. And then industrial composting, if you wonder how they get compost material into bags that you buy off the shelf at the store, well, they're coming out of large industrial facilities that are composting usually in windrows or different large scale operations where they're using machinery, $1 million machinery and turning those compost piles daily or weekly, and they're massive operations. And so when you go buy compost in bulk or when you go buy compost in bagged off the shelf, you're getting it that's been processed through a facility like this. So again, backyard composting, it requires 3 by 3 feet to hot compost, and it takes, if you're hot composting, about 6 months to a year. You can really speed up if you use things like tumblers and things. You can speed up because you're creating that airflow and you're containing the conditions. In community composting, usually community composting is grassroots organized, and it's often the response to just no options at the municipal level. People are interested in composting, but maybe they don't have the ability to do it in their backyard, or their municipality has no options for diverting that waste, and so they get together in a neighborhood, and maybe they have a lot or a park or somewhere they can do that. And then again, industrial composting, it's pretty amazing what's happening on this front with the industrial composting. Most of the roadside Department of Transportation projects, they use composting to, after they've built a new roadway or a bridge or whatever to put down and use as a seed bed for establishing vegetation. They can churn out compost incredibly fast. I mean, within a week or less even, there are some composting methods that can take a deer carcass, animal carcass from the side of the road, and within a matter of 7 to 10 days, they have finished compost at the end. So it's pretty incredible, some of the things that are happening on the industrial side of composting. What factors affect composting? Again, it's that balance of carbon to nitrogen, so that ratio, the size of your particles. The larger the material you're putting into your compost pile, the longer it's going to take for that to break down. So the smaller you can get your pieces, the more rapidly you're going to yield the finished compost. Moisture is really important, and also aeration, and those two are really important. You need enough moisture to be this happy, moist place for the microorganisms. You don't need it to be too wet, and you don't want it to be too dry. And so typically it's described when you're talking about a compost pile, you want it to almost feel like a wrung out sponge. You want it to kind of have that damp feeling without being, if you picked it up, you don't want to see water running out of it, but you don't want it to be dry and crusty either. You want it to maintain kind of this just kind of dampness on it. And that's going to help those conditions stay ripe for breakdown. You also need airflow. So, oxygen flowing through the pile is really, really important. And that's why if you build, say, a pallet bin, having those vents on the sides allows air to move through. If you see people that are composting in piles on a big scale, if they're not turning it regularly, which is probably the best way to aerate those piles, sometimes they'll create chimneys in the middle to basically pull air through the pile. Aeration is really, really key for breakdown. And those are all things that we can control. So the nice thing as backyard composters is we determine, based on how much effort and labor and things we want to put into our composting, how quickly we would yield results. Don't get too hung up on this carbon and nitrogen stuff. I'm going to go through some of the basic science of it so that you understand. As I said before, the bottom line is you're trying to create about a 3-to-1 brown to green ratio. And so carbon is the material that's found usually in the cellulose and lignin of the cell. It's what gives the cell walls their strength. So in plants, it's usually found in like the stems and things like that. The nitrogen is mostly found in plant protein. So that would be the fruits of the plants, the leaves of the plants, things like that. And the ratio of carbon to nitrogen, when we talk about balancing carbon and nitrogen, we're talking about the dry weight of those two within the material. And so maximum composting efficiency, if you're trying to nail down the science of it and you're doing it on a scale where you're churning out compost very quickly and you're composting very efficiently, you're trying to get to that 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen ratio, that 30-to-1 ratio. And so how do you do that? You kind of have to have a little bit of an understanding of what are your carbon sources, what are your nitrogen sources, what the typical ratio of those are. Grass clippings tend to have, depending on how old they are, fresh cut grass clippings are going to be much less carbonaceous. They're going to have a lower carbon to nitrogen profile. And the older they get, as they age, they dry out, they're going to be more carbonaceous. And so, somewhere between that 12 to 25 to 1 ratio. And so, if we just split the difference and we say grass clippings are 15 to 1. Leaves are going to be even more carbonaceous. So they're going to range somewhere between 30 to 80 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, depending on, again, the age, how long they've been off the tree, how dry they are. And then vegetable waste is going to be somewhere in that 12 to 20. And so if we just kind of split the difference on all of those and we say, okay, we're making a compost pile and we have these ingredients, then we can say, okay, our grass clippings represent 15 to 1, leaves 60 to 1, veggies 12 to 1. That gives us an 87/3. If we do a little bit of simple middle school math, we can get that we're at a 29 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, which would mean that we're in a really efficient carbon to nitrogen ratio for our pile, right? So if we put all that together, we would be efficiently composting. However, I don't like to mess with that, and it can get really confusing. And how do you really know what your carbon material is, how much carbon it has? Those are generalities. So the best rule of thumb is just for every 3 parts brown dry material you use 1 part nitrogen green wet material. And if you can keep that balance, you will compost effectively and efficiently. Again, particle size is really important. It's going to impact the speed of composting. So if you have the ability to, like if you're composting kind of woody plant material from your, like for instance, I have a bunch of sunflowers in my yard, and at the end of the year, I'll usually pull those out and I'll just chop up using loppers or something. I'll chop up that material into as small pieces as I can get and use that in my compost pile. If you use larger bits, that's fine, but it's going to take you a lot longer to break that down. So the smaller you can get it, the better. Some people, if they have like a little home scale grinder, you can get those for like 99 bucks at Home Depot or Lowe's, and you can put small, maybe 2, 3, 4 inch in diameter wood pieces through. You can grind up material to then have smaller particle sizes for your compost pile. Again, water is really important. You're trying to maintain about that 50% moisture. You don't want it to be too wet. You don't want it to be too dry. You just want that happy medium. And so, some of that's going to depend on your placement of the pile. If it's outside and we've been getting lots of rain, it's possible that you have periods of time that your pile's too wet. And so it's just kind of monitoring, it's paying attention, and it's reacting to what its needs are. So when you're trying to water the pile, again, you want it to feel like a wet sponge. So you'll water it until water runs freely through the pile, and then you stop. You don't want it to be a soppy mess. You just kind of want it to be nice and damp. You want to turn piles as necessary. So there's no real rule of thumb other than the more often you oxygenate it, the faster you're going to break down. And so some people, if they have the energy and the ability and effort, they're doing it every few days. Some people it's once a week. Some people it might be once a month or once every several months. It just kind of depends on how big your pile is, how much physical ability and time ability you have to do that. So if you're composting a small wire mesh that you filled with leaves, and maybe you've mixed in coffee grounds. We did this at our extension office actually. We just turned it once a week. And so what we did is we filled it with leaves and mixed coffee grounds in there from Starbucks. They'll give you the bagged coffee grounds. So we just layered 3-to-1 coffee grinds and leaves and built a pile that was about 3 feet wide and 3 feet tall. And once a week, we gave it a drink. We wetted it down, and once a week, we would take the mesh and move it to the side, and then take all that material and flip it back into itself to turn it. So it got water once a week and turned once a week. And we laid a little tarp over it actually to prevent too much rainfall from getting into it so that we could control the once a week water, once a week turning. And we were able to see pretty much usable finished broken down compost in about 6 to 7 weeks using just leaves and the coffee grinds for our nitrogen source. Oxygen is really important. So I think if we had turned it twice a week, we probably would have seen faster breakdown. Again, hot composting, you need temperatures that are between 100 and 140 degrees to really hot compost. So when you're hot composting, you get the right carbon to nitrogen ratio, the right moisture, and the right size of pile. You'll see, you can put a thermometer in, your pile will start to increase in temperature, and it'll kind of peak somewhere in that 100 to 140 range, and it'll stay there for a while, and then it'll start to come back down. And you know that the composting process is finishing as it comes back down and cools down below, to a more normal, stable temperature. If you want to compost things that have, like weed seeds or things that plant material that might have diseases and things like that, and you want to compost confidently knowing that you're not going to take seeds that were in that compost pile and transfer them to your garden beds or wherever you would use the compost, you have to hot compost in order to do that. If you're cold composting, you're not going to effectively terminate the seeds and other things that are in the compost. So again, compost quality, if you're hot composting, once your compost is cooled back down, just reach in there, look at it, turn it, mix it up. You might think, well, there's still a lot of material, there's a lot of bits of material, there's lots of 2-inch pieces of wood, or there's a bit of this, bit of that. Take that, if it looks like there's still some woody material in there, and screen it out. That stuff that falls below is the awesome finished compost. I recommend you can get like a 1/2 inch diameter mesh material at any hardware store and just put that over a wheelbarrow, or mount it onto some boards and shake the compost material over that, and the finished stuff will fall through. So if you're going to compost at home, which I hope many of you are now not too overwhelmed and are considering the possibility of doing it at home, it's good to think about where you locate your compost pile. So when you're selecting a site, I say here 6 hours of sunlight, and really that is not a hard and fast rule. It's more about how you're going to manage it. So if you're cold composting and you're not going to be controlling the moisture, the airflow, all that very regularly, then the more exposure you can give it, the better, because it's going to be more exposed to the elements. Water is going to be more exposed to the wind and to the sunlight and things that are going to aid in its breakdown. If you're controlling the compost and you have a plan in place, like I was describing, where we watered it and we turned it once a week, we actually covered it because we wanted to keep it from getting too wet or too dry. And so if you're cold composting, definitely want to expose it to the elements. You can move more into the shade or in other areas if you're going to be turning it more often. You don't want it to detract from the landscape. You don't want your neighbors to call on you. You don't want your spouse or other people in the family who maybe aren't so into composting as you are to give you a hard time about it. So you want to find a spot that not only aesthetically works, but also is going to work for you in terms of physical location. So for me, I have a backyard that's a little over an acre. And when I first built my compost pile, I positioned it as in the far back corner of my property as possible, which I thought was great because it was away from everything. And what I realized is I wasn't utilizing it as often as I would like to, because in the evenings, in the mornings, as I had material to put out in the compost pile, I just delayed because it was a challenge to take the trek out there and put it out there and do the work. And so I've actually moved it a little bit closer to my house so that I see it a little bit more, and it's more in my face, and I'm convicted to go and address it because I see it. If I don't see it, I'm not going to deal with it as much. You also want to think about, is it near a water source? If you're going to be watering regularly, you don't want to be hauling buckets of water for a mile to go water your compost pile. So, troubleshooting your compost pile. If you start composting and you notice a strong odor, more often than not, you aren't giving enough oxygen. Or it could be that it's too wet and you need more dry material. So if it's stinky, you want to dry it down and turn it. If it's too wet and it's not heating up, you probably need more nitrogen, or it could be too wet, more grass clippings. If it's dry and just not breaking down, again, always adding water and then oxygenation are key. If it's got an ammonia smell, it probably has too much of the nitrogen sources. So that stinky pile. If it feels real sharp on your nose, it's attracting bugs and things. It's probably got too many food scraps and not enough dry material. So again, of all the things I've told you, if I were to boil the most key secret ingredient to compost, in my opinion, I would say it's oxygen. I think the more you turn the pile, the more you allow it to be exposed to airflow, the quicker you're going to see breakdown. Composting is one of those subjects that you just cannot do it justice in 45 minutes to an hour. So today my goal was to throw a bunch at you, give you some resources, give you my phone number, let you know that we have resources available to help you if you are interested in getting started composting. My goal was to lay it out there for you, hopefully not overwhelm you too much, and encourage you that home composting can be fun, it can be easier than you realize, and it can be a really good and effective way to get awesome material for your landscape and garden uses. It's a great way to divert waste if you have concerns about your environmental footprint, and so those are all things that compost benefits. I just started, we just finished a 6-week training. Every year I do a master composter training program, and we just started this year. We go for 6 weeks and we talk about composting. And so for people who really, really, really want to learn about composting, we go 6 weeks intense. We do 3-hour classes 3 to 4 hour classes every day, every week for 6 weeks, and we go through composting. We build piles together, we troubleshoot, we build vermicomposting bins to take home and learn how to compost with worms. We hear from people who are experts in composting around the community. We learn about everything from backyard composting to large-scale composting. So if you think that's something you might be interested in the future, you can note that on your survey, or you can just send me an email. But I don't have dates or times or anything planned out for 2020, but just know that there will be more to come, more information on that if you're interested in composting and would like to go a little bit deeper. So if you've heard of our Master Gardener training program, it's very similar to that, where we train people in gardening and we go in depth. It's the same thing, but it's for composting.